A stream by the ACT Chess Association covering the one remaining online event which we're holding here in Canberra. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and do a video summary normally the day after. In this case, the event we are looking at is the ACTCA standard event, which is being played with a time limit of 40 minutes at the start, plus 15 seconds per move to go on with. It was to replace the long time control events we were holding in clubs while ACT went through a 3-month lockdown. Good news is that lockdown's finished, and so at this point everyone's back face to face and playing. So Tuggeranong Chess Club goes back this Monday. The Gungahlin Chess Club started on Tuesday night with a good turnout of 20 players plus extras, and the Canberra Chess Club is going back shortly and restarting their event. So with all these events up and running, we're back to playing face-to-face chess mainly, but people do like this long time control event. It's on an evening which doesn't clash with any of the local clubs, and we still had half the tournament to finish. So we're up to round 4, and the game I'm choosing was actually played on the top board between Lachlan Smart and Matt Radicic, and there was a small funny incident at Gungahlin Chess Club on Tuesday night when it looked like Lachlan Smart was coming to play, but I believe Lachlan Smart was currently in Japan, and it turned out it wasn't Lachlan Smart, it's just someone who looks a lot like him under a mask. But anyway, so this game was played online between the two leading players in the tournament. It was our board 1 match. Now, to be fair, this isn't all crash and bash, this one. I tend to choose exciting games and lots of sacrifices to make it interesting, but this is a much quieter game, but there are lots of lessons to be found in this game as well, and I will explain as I go along. So let's just kick off. e4, e5, knight f3, 6. So this is just our Jacques au piano, the quiet game, and today it kind of lived up to that name of the quiet game. And white castle. Now, castling is normally not considered the right move here, but it turns out that you can swap back into the lines that the game ended up in. The much more violent and exciting move is c3, and you get knight f6 hitting the pawn, and it all kicks off with a move like d4. Takes, bishop check, knight to c3 is the old main line, knight takes e4, and this has been analysed for 400 years, this position. There are sacrifices everywhere and spectacular checkmates and so on and so forth, but most of it's actually been dealt with in the early to mid-60s, and it's considered this specific line favours black a little bit. I'm not going to go into the whole line, just turns out that black can beat off the attack and stay a pawn ahead. Rolling back slightly, if white wants to play it a little bit safer, just something like bishop d2 is also good. And after we take, knight takes, and as long as black remembers to play d5 in this position, this is pretty equal. Again, I'm not going to go too far. And the other move that you can play way back after knight f6 is just to play d3 and swap and head back into the lines that happened in the game. Instead, white castled, played the knight f6, and white immediately played d3, which is now essentially the very quiet Italian, I suppose. And black could castle, and after c3, d6, we kind of get the same setup. Black played d6 straight away, so white played c3. Normally c3 is designed to support the d4 move, but in this case the purpose of this is twofold. One, to keep the black knight out of d4 in case the bishop comes a pinning down here onto g4, and also for white to be able to play a move like b4 in this position here. In fact, I was playing some practice games in real life on Tuesday night against a student of mine, and consistently I was winning the game simply because I had the almost beginner's plan of playing the bishop to g4 to pin the knight, then playing the knight from c6 into d4, then destroying the kingside pawn structure. Might talk about that another day, but for now, bishop to g4. So a4 seems like a slightly odd move if you've never seen it before, but the whole point here is to take more space on the queen side, shown dramatically if black castles. We played b4, bishop here, a5, and we've just trapped the bishop. The bishop's got no squares to go to at this point, and white's just won that bishop. So this is why black will play a6 here to give a escape path for the bishop. b4. Now, I've always found a decision as black, I've played this position a few times, as black's slightly tricky. Do I move the bishop back to b7, a7, sorry, or do I move it just to b6? My preference has always been for a7 for various reasons, but the engine thinks that this is not as good as b6, possibly because the idea of playing b5 isn't as great as necessarily the idea of playing a5. But again, I don't think it's as big enough a difference to decide that one player is winning or not. So the bishop just went back to b6, but at some point a5 could happen, but maybe black doesn't care. So let's just keep developing for a while. The other option was to take the chance at this point just to play h3. Not because you want to chase the bishop around with g4, even although that idea turns up later. But after bishop to g5, you're kind of playing the moves you want to play, but at the same time, you've just dealt with the risk of any back rank checkmates later in the game. A move like h3 on its own, if it doesn't do anything else, is sometimes a waste of time. But in this case, it's actually asking black to decide what to do with the bishop. So you're gaining a little bit of a tempo here by playing it. So rook went to e1 instead. My preference would have been for black to castle. Leaving the king in the center, even if you don't think the king is going to get attacked down the middle of the board, can cause problems. You probably should castle when you can. h3, bishop h5, a5, bishop a7, bishop g5. And in this line, white's got a lot of space. The pawns on the queen side have taken up a lot of squares. The bishop has gone to g5 to pin. And the idea here is after something like queen e7 to try and deal with that pin, knight bd2. Now, bit of advice I received a while ago for positions like this. I'm going to go all the way back to somewhere like this. Is the strategy for both sides is to pretend you've played a Ruy Lopez. Closed Italians, you can pretend instead you've played a Ruy Lopez because the pawn structures are very similar. So this means that when you get to a position like this, white's plan isn't I'm going to try and checkmate you on f7 in the other lines of the Gioco Piano. Treating it like a Ruy Lopez means that you're going to slowly build up your position. For example, this knight on c2 is going to go to f1. White's probably going to play g4 because the king side is reasonably secure and so is the center. And then it's knight g3, knight f5, which you see a lot in the Ruy Lopez. So knight went back to e7. I would have castled because this is a little bit slow. Knight, of course, comes out. I think the argument for the knight going back was to deal with something like bishop g5, but you could still play bishop g5, I think. Knight to g6. So it's black, not white, who's trying to get the knights across to the king side first. h3, yep. So we put the question to the bishop here. And bishop d7 was the right retreat. Because if you play bishop h5, things get a little bit too crowded on the king side, and you can run into some problems. So a5 for some space, bishop go back, and then knight f1 looking at knight g3. Bishop takes f3 is probably forced if you want to survive, but after queen takes f3 and castles, the f5 square is now a good square for that knight on f1, and white is a little bit better. Instead of taking, if you decide to castle, then g4 sometimes is a problem here, and the risk is that you're exposing your king by moving the pawns in front of it. But in this case, you've won a piece. So it's a piece for 2 pawns. You should be able to beat off the attack. It may take a little bit of time to get properly organized, but once you've beaten off the attack, you're going to be fine. So this is why the bishop ran back to d7. Instead of getting caught on the king side, head back to d7. Knight goes to f1 following the Ruy Lopez plan. a5 was suggested, but after b5 again. The only advantage of this is that the bishop on b6 is perfectly fine. It's got that nice diagonal for itself, and it's not going to get kicked off that. So castles. And after d4, bishop e6, white hit upon a plan which unfortunately turned out to be the wrong plan for 2 reasons. One, white has more space than black. Black's a little bit cramped. And normally under those circumstances, what you want to do is keep your pieces on the board. If black doesn't have room for the pieces, the more pieces you keep on the board, the better off you are, because eventually black's pieces are going to trip over themselves. So, something like, I'm going to say it is a little bit awkward about where to put the bishop in this position. And you can just play d5 here and aim for some more space, of course, and block off the center. But I think White decided that broken pawn structure was going to count for more. And I'm going to explain why in this case it just didn't work. So we take, and we take, and it's doubled. And then we take, and we take. And we keep swapping. So now Black has 2 pawns on e6 and e5. Doubled and isolated, so White thought, maybe that's a plus for me. Let's get rid of queens next. Rook takes. Let's play bishop to e3 to get rid of that bishop as well. But Black played some really good moves here, I think. And Black probably understood what was going on in this position a lot better than White. With rook to d3, hitting the weakness on the c-pawn, it also encouraged White to continue with that plan of let's just swap stuff off. Takes and takes. And sure, at this point, the pawns marked in yellow are sort of a bit of a worry. Right? They're double pawns and they're isolated pawns. But Black is still better in this position. And the reason why Black is still better can almost go back to 2 great world champions. They can go back to Capablanca and Alekhine. When Capablanca came along, one of the things he used to help him essentially become the world champion, and just to be an all-round god of a chess player, was a pawn structure. He understood that weakened pawn structures provide more opportunities for him to win the game. So he would keep his pawn structure intact. He would look at ways of damaging his opponent's pawn structure, and damaged pawn structures created bad endings for his opponent, and he'd just go on and win. Alekhine comes along, and Alekhine has a different point of view. He understands that bad pawn structures create weaknesses. So basically, the 2 pawns on e6 and e5 don't defend each other. But he didn't mind getting bad pawn structures if it opened up the position for his pieces, because Alekhine, of course, is fantastic at attacking play, using the initiative to win. And this is what Black has. Black has more active rooks in this position, more weaknesses to attack. The c-pawn, for example, is not great, and the e-pawn is under attack as well. So essentially, Black has static weaknesses but dynamic advantages. And this is what Black then used to actually get a much better position. So the rook came across to defend the pawn, and the other rook comes across now using the open c file to attack the pawn, and that's very difficult to defend because what White chose was to play rook e3 here. You could try and avoid the worst of it with f3, and the argument being here is sure you lose a pawn, but Black's weaknesses haven't gone away. So after rook here, rook c1, rook d3, this position is still slightly better for Black because Black has won a pawn, but there are lots of moves here that can cause trouble now in this position for Black, including just simple ideas of playing the rook check and then the rook behind the b-pawn, rook d6, although rook to c6 is going to try to defend. Once the rook retreats from pinning the knight, activating the knight. So White has a lot of play, but White has got to find this play. I'll just come back to this position of interest because if Black swaps the rooks off on the grounds that I'm a pawn up and therefore I should be winning, this actually helps White completely because the knight gets activated. The knight's going to c4 to fork the weak pawns on b6 and e5 and also head for d6 to attack the pawn on b7. So notice that this game has turned into a game about weaknesses. Okay? So after everything got exchanged off all the way back here, starting with this move, okay, what we're left with is working out what things are weak and what things aren't weak. And it turns out that Black was able to use the weaknesses in White's position, surprisingly, to simply win a pawn. After rook e3, we swap, knight activates, and then the e4 pawn drops. Okay. So Black is up a pawn. But this is not the end of it. Black is better, but talking about weaknesses, to win positions like this, especially that Black has still got this horrible, horrible pawn structure, is you probably need more than one weakness to deal with. What's going to happen here is certainly Black is attacking the weak c-pawn, and going 2 pawns up should be an easy win. But White is going to dig in. So c4 to protect. h5 makes sense to try and keep the knight out of g4 because you don't want to drop the e-pawn. Funnily enough, knight d2 might have been slightly stronger move here because it stops the king getting across into the centre. And after something like rook c2, we're going to play knight back to d4, which happened in the game, but a little bit faster for black and a little bit slower for white. Because after h5, king went to f1, and I'd probably either recommend bringing the king into the centre because this becomes important, might as well do it now, or even rook d8. Okay? Just give up on the fact that the c-pawn for now is a weakness and just try and move on to other advantages. You're looking at things like even rook d2 in this position. Instead, knight d2, king e2 here, knight goes to b3, of course, rook goes to c3, and the knight went back to d4. But in this case, the king has run from g1 all the way across to d3 when the knight gets to d4. In other lines, the knight was on d4, so it made it harder for the king to get across. So, black is still up a pawn, but white is digging in here, and this is the problem that black has, is that the e-pawns aren't able to break through at the moment. They're doing a great job, or one is doing a great job of supporting the knight. And white doesn't have that many weaknesses to attack. The principle of two weaknesses kind of applies here, that if your opponent only has one weakness on the board, they will defend it to the death. But if they've got two weaknesses, you can generally jump around and target them, and eventually they can't defend both of them. So king comes to the center, which is nice. King goes to the middle. And essentially, this is the point. The c-pawn is the only weakness that black seems to be focusing on. And on the other hand, the white king is nicely centralized. The b6 pawn is still a bit of a weakness. The e5 pawn is still a bit of a weakness. But black is a pawn up. So black is, it's not winning for white. Take off one of black's pawns, and it's a little bit more problematic. So, moving on, king to f6 to defend the pawn, but g4 was played here. Now, speaking of looking for weaknesses, h4 was probably the right move here, because if white tries something like g5 to deflect the king away from the center, king takes, knight check here, king takes, knight takes b4. Okay, and black is still a pawn up, and essentially what black has given away is the two central e-pawns. 4 pawns on either side of the board, and you might think, no, aren't central pawns stronger? Sure. But in this case, what black has actually gained is lots of targets. The pawn on f2 is now a weakness, the pawn on h3 is now a weakness, the pawn on c4 still remains a weakness, even the pawn on a4 might be a weakness. Black, on the other hand, king is nice and placed in the center, but black now has what we might call a target-rich environment. There are lots of things that we can take. So instead of previously going, I've got one weakness and my opponent is defending it and it's very frustrating, suddenly it's like, I've got chances in this position to start picking things up. And this is probably what you want to aim for in a practical way if you're black here, was to get a position like this. It's not any much better or worse than the previous position in terms of final assessment, but your chances of finding something in the game have improved dramatically. So, instead, g6 was played, pawn up, okay, rook to c7, g5 drives the king back. Now, maybe black didn't worry about, in this position, the e-pawn hanging, because, to be honest, white really can't capture the e5 pawn, because after king e7, if you grab this, you've got two relatively pleasant choices for black. One is knight back here to c6, and after the king moves, you're just taking on b4. Okay? And again, the c-pawn becomes harder to defend and the a-pawn becomes harder to defend because it's isolated. The other option was knight f3, which I looked at during the game. And after the king goes back, you just take here on h4. And after something like c5, which is fine for black because you're fixing your pawn structure, knight f5, knight takes, pawn takes. And as much as Stockfish or Fritz says, this is kind of only slightly better for black, I like black's position here simply because the h-pawn is a protected pass pawn, so it's going to be hard for the white king to do anything because it's got to always keep an eye on that pawn. But c5 was played here, and after b takes, black actually missed their final chance in this position. b5 is the move here, because again you want to create more play than just looking at the c pawn for the rest of the game. And after takes and takes, king takes e5, don't stress, knight check here, king goes back, and then rook a7 is the right move. And essentially there are two things in play here. One, there's just the very obvious threat of just moving the rook to a4 and picking up the h pawn. And also there's a much more subtle thing going on here, and I'll refer back to Capablanca again. One of the things that he was particularly good at when he played endings is what I've termed conquering ranks. So basically what he wants to do is he wants to control all the squares up to a certain point. And then once he's controlled all the squares up to a certain rank, he brings his pieces up, and then he conquers the next rank. And he just pushes his opponent back. And here's a nice example. For example, you play rook b3. You hit the pawn on b5. Rook check, first move. King to d3. Rook check here. King to c2. And you've pretty much now just conquered all of the fourth rank, or white's fourth rank. So white's pieces are all being pushed back. And you can afford to take here, by the way, because if white executes that little plan of taking on b5, then oopsie doopsie, knight to d4, forking king and rook. So could have played that to try and conquer the rank, but knight c6, and unfortunately for black at this point, the game is now a draw. So the knight went to c4, and it turns out there's nothing really left in this position. b5 doesn't work anymore because you just take on passant, and it's all done. So rook went to the d file, at least to go for a square, but then after rook here, rook here, rook here, the players shook hands. So in terms of winning and losing, there wasn't any dramatic points where one player was easily winning and the other player wasn't, or a massive blunder. But on the other hand, there was a lot of interest in the game, at least for me, while going through it, especially because of sort of what we call teachable moments. The notion of trying to maximize your chances in a position by creating more targets. The notion that you can normally defend a position, even a pawn down, if you've only got one weakness and you play the best moves that you can, especially where there's no breakthrough. And also the strategy of swapping things off is okay, especially if you're using it to damage your opponent's pawn structure. But make sure you've still got enough pieces left on the board to win the game after that. So that was a fairly comprehensive coverage of that game. I've gone through a lot of lines here, and in the end it was a draw, which leaves, I think, Matt Rad still in the lead in the tournament along with two other players. We've got one round to go for this event, and that's next week. I think there are 3 players on 4 out of 5, and then another pile of players on 3.5. So thanks for tuning in. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association. Do these broadcasts the day after, normally 10 a.m. Canberra time. We're down to one online event a week, so I'm only going to be turning up on Fridays doing these streams from now on. But thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.